I wanted to start with the opening of the famous Dickens novel, A Tale of Two Cities. Everybody knows it starts with, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And I want to use that as my overarching quotation for what I'm going to talk about, because the Middle East right now is in some ways the best of times, and I'll explain what I mean by that, and in other ways, which are more evident, self-evident, the worst of times. I wouldn't say that it's the best of times, but in terms of what's happening between Iran and the West, these are the most promising times in relations between those two groups since 1979. We have a real opportunity to achieve something that was last possible in 2003. Then President Khatami of Iran proposed what was called a grand bargain, which is how we came to the title of our presentation tonight. The grand bargain would involve normalizing relations between Iran and the West, and Iran giving up its nuclear program. Unfortunately, the Bush administration was not interested. It was infected with Islamophobia and ideological arterial sclerosis and all sorts of other things, and they had no interest in reaching an agreement with Iran. So that was shelved. And coming back to now, I would say, though President Obama is lacking in many qualities that I wish he had, I think he's smart enough to realize that he really cannot miss this opportunity. President Hassan Rouhani of Iran has reached out his hand, literally and figuratively, and said, let's get this deal done, and let's get it done fast. And he has the permission and the approval of the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. There is no better or other time to do this than now. There are negotiations going on right now in Geneva. And unlike previous rounds of negotiations that have gone on between Iran and the West over the nuclear program, these are making progress. There was a report yesterday in a very good online news source called AL Monitor, which covers the Middle East, and it was written by Barbara Slavin, who's a well-known DC Middle East analyst who writes for The Atlantic, not the magazine, but the organization, the Atlantic Council. And she said that Iran's proposal in Geneva is the following. We, Iran, will give up enriching uranium beyond 20%. You need to enrich uranium to 90% to get it to bomb grade. 20% to 90% is much faster than 0 to 20. So Iran is saying we will stop going over 20, and what we have that is at 20, we will turn into we will turn into nuclear fuel rods and other sort of inert forms that can't be used to enrich to a higher level, but might be able to be used for creating medical isotopes and medical research and other forms that are not weapons oriented. There are other important parts of this plan. It would offer the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Inspection Organization, monitoring of the latest top secret Iran facility in Fordo, which is where they're enriching uranium with their most advanced technology, and is top secret. It's 300 feet underground. It's impenetrable to all but U.S. 30,000-pound bunker bombs, which Dick and I have talked about in previous talks. Israel does not have that kind of bunker bomb, so it cannot attack Fordo. So it is almost impenetrable unless we attacked. Iran is now saying, we will open the door and let the IAEA in there. It has been secret until now. No IAEA inspectors, as far as I know, have been inside that facility. It will now open it up under this agreement. Also, it would open up another top secret facility, a heavy water reactor in Arak, A-R-A-K, in Iran, that is plutonium-based. It's a heavy water reactor, but it makes plutonium, which is another way at getting at creating a nuclear weapon. It's offered to open Arak to IAEA inspection. These are really momentous changes in Iran's position. And that's why she wrote this piece that I mentioned to you. So lest anybody be skeptical about how important this is, she quotes the director of the Arms Control Association, whose name is Darrell Kimball, and he says that if this is true, this is, quote, a genuine, serious response to the P5+1, that's the group of Western nations negotiating with Iran. The P5+1 proposal presented in April at Almaty, that was a previous round of negotiations, which was not a final offer from P5+1. He added, Kimball added, the offer to stop production of 20% enriched uranium and convert the stockpile into fuel rods, quote, essentially meets the goal of P5+1 to stop production and ship out the remaining material, while the proposed solution on Iraq should also be very appealing to the P5+1, especially since Iran doesn't even have a plutonium separation facility that it could use to extract plutonium from Iraq's spent fuel rods. Iraq also, well, it goes on. Another quote from this article that's important is from the U.S. chief negotiator in this ongoing round of talks. Her name is Wendy Sherman. She said, quote, Foreign Minister Zarif, that's the Iranian foreign minister, came prepared for detailed substantive discussion with a candor that I have not heard in the 2 years I've been meeting with Iranians. And my P5+1 colleagues, some of whom have been doing this for quite some time, found it quite new and different. Listen to the music. The music is changing. Thank goodness it's changing from what it's been in the past. And it's changing largely because Iran now has leadership that wants to make a deal, I believe, I hope and believe. I can't think of better, more promising words than these for this stage of the talks. Of course, there is a long way to go. It's a negotiation that won't happen overnight, but there's much stronger will on both sides to get it done. In her report, Slavin adds that the Iranians foresee an agreement implemented in 2 stages, each one taking 6 months. She does talk about what the first stage would be, but doesn't talk about what the second stage would be, which I thought was a little odd, but I'm going to try to fill in what I think she was saying. The first stage, I think, is what Iran would do, everything that I've just talked about. Second stage has to be what the West is going to do. It has to be. This is the problem with all the reporting and all the think tank analysis that deals with Iran. They all talk about what Iran needs to do, and then they forget that there's any reciprocity needed with the West. Now, Iran is not forgetting. Iran expects something from the West in return. We always forget to say what it is that we're willing to give them if they give us what we want. So, in my mind, what the West is going to have to do is to stop the sanctions, or at least heavily ease the sanctions in some serious way. Her article, Barbara Slavin, only talks about the West offering Iran medicine. Iran cannot it cannot import medicine from abroad. So you can imagine if the United States, well, we produce a lot of our medicine, but in a country like Iran, they import a lot of their complex medication for their cancer patients and whatever. They can't do that because they can't finance any of the purchase of the medication. So we're offering medicine. Now, I don't know about you, medicine is nice, it's very important, people are very sick, they need it, but this is not going to persuade the Iranians to give up, essentially put a halt to their nuclear program. We are going to have to do more than that. We are going to have to ease sanctions, and we are going to have to talk about an end game. And that is what is also new about this round of negotiations. Iran is coming to the U.S. and saying, we will talk about just about anything, but we want to know what's going to happen at the end. What are you going to do at the end? We don't want to keep dithering for years and years and years, and we do what you want with our nuclear program, and then we don't find out what you're going to give us in return. So, normalization is what needs to happen at the end. And that's what the grand bargain in 2003 offered. Normalization. Iran and the West would become co-equal partners in the international arena, Iran would take its place, its rightful place as a nation both in the region, in the Gulf, and in the world. The West would not attempt to destabilize Iran as it has, especially Israel has been doing that in a very overt, covert, quasi-overt way, killing nuclear scientists and fomenting unrest among ethnic groups in Iran with killings and assassinations and bombings. So that is what the West will have to promise, stop the destabilization of Iran. In return, I think the West can also demand that Iran stop some of its attempts to destabilize some of its neighbors. And especially what I mean is supplying weapons to some of the key frontline states dealing with Israel. Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and Russia are the major arms suppliers for Assad in Syria. So I think the West has a legitimate call to Iran to stop arming some of these people. If this grand bargain, this is what I'm calling the new grand bargain, can work, and I fully acknowledge that it's very complicated and will involve a lot of steps along the way, but if this happens, the Middle East becomes quite a different place than it is right now. Now let's talk about the worst of times, going back to the Dickens quote. We've been talking about it here with what we've said about Syria. We haven't mentioned Egypt. Egypt has been basically consumed by a military coup. The generals run Egypt now, unfortunately. Our government was very slow to denounce the Egyptian coup, unfortunately. And in Syria, as Jim and Dick told you, we came within a whisker of a disastrous military intervention there. And thank God the wisdom of the American people, collectively for a change, worked. And Obama was faced with this almost unanimous opposition from Congress and from the American people to a military adventure in Syria. And thank God for that. But despite the fact that we have not intervened, it's still basically a disaster. Syria is a failed state. You saw on the screen how it's divided into these ethnic enclaves. The south is largely Shiite and Alawite, and the north and the east of the country is largely Sunni. And it's 80%, I think, you said 60% Sunni. So that top part of that map is all Sunni. Syria is disintegrating, essentially, into these enclaves, which is not good. The Assad regime has two friends in the world. I've mentioned them just earlier, Russia and Iran. They're both giving it massive amounts of advanced weapons that enable it to fight the rebel forces to a stalemate, which is why we have this disintegration into these enclaves. My hope is that the success in these Geneva nuclear talks and the talks that will follow, which I hope will end with a negotiation and a resolution of the nuclear program, can also lead right into a resolution of the conflict with Syria. Because Syria, as Dick rightfully said, is not just an internal issue, it is an international issue because it fronts on Turkey and on Iraq and on Israel and on Lebanon, and they all are this potentially fatal mix of chemicals that with a match could explode. And any one of these countries could make that explosion happen. And I personally am most interested in Israel, but it could happen with any of the others I mentioned. So I just mentioned Israel. It's not exactly the 800-pound gorilla in the room here, but it is big and it can do a lot of damage if it wants to. It will and is already trying to undermine the talks with Iran. The right-wing government in Israel does not want reconciliation with Iran. It does not want a a resolution of the nuclear problem, because Israel's goal is for Iran not to have any nuclear program, and that is not what is going to happen. If there is a successful negotiation, Iran is going to be left with some nuclear program. It will be allowed to enrich uranium up to a certain percentage, maybe 5%. But even under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries are allowed to have a civilian nuclear program. And that's what Iran will end up having when this resolution, hopefully, this agreement is reached. Israel doesn't want that. Israel will not accept anything less than no nuclear program. I would even maintain Israel will not stop until there is regime change in Iran, which goes back to what I was talking about. A final agreement would have to end destabilization of the Iranian regime. So Israel would be forced, potentially, to stop the kinds of shenanigans it's done with the assassinations of the scientists and the explosions at Iranian military bases that Israel has been covertly involved with. Israel has also allied itself with Iran's enemies in the Gulf, the Sunni states, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and it is talking about a military coalition against Iran, which means that there are a group of countries that are considering military options against Iran. I don't think that we as a country are considering that, but Israel is deciding basically that if I can't get Obama to do what I need him to do, I'm going to turn to my friends closer at hand. I'm going to turn to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis are very incensed by what's been going on. They're incensed by the fact that the U.S. turned away from attacking Assad's forces in Syria, which is Saudi Arabia is supporting the Sunni Islamist rebels in Syria, and they wanted to see Assad get a bloody nose, and they wanted the U.S. to do it, and we turned our backs on the Saudis. We also, if we come to this agreement with Iran, again, we'll be turning our backs on the Saudis, because the Saudis don't want, the Saudis are competing in the region with Iran as who's going to be the dominant power in the region. You may have heard that Saudi Arabia was offered this plum in the UN Security Council. Countries campaigned for years to get a Security Council seat. Saudi Arabia this week was offered a Security Council seat. I saw a video of all the countries that were awarded these seats, and when the UN ambassador of the country that won the seat was announced, they were giving each other high fives. They were jumping up and down, and Saudi Arabia said, no, we're not taking one. Out of pique, a fit of pique, because they are so angry and pissed at the United States for what they've done. It's dangerous to have countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel that are nursing a grudge. They can do a lot of damage. I'm hoping there's a way to contain any damage, and I'm hoping that those two countries and the other countries allied with them won't do anything stupid, like attacking Iran, but it's conceivable. And also, domestically, Israel runs the Israel Lobby, AIPAC, and these other organizations that funnel millions of dollars into congressional and senatorial campaigns. And Israel doesn't want the U.S. Congress, which will have to ease these sanctions, to do it. So there will have to be votes in Congress to ease sanctions. And the Israel lobby is putting every ounce of pressure that it can on its friends in Congress, its many, many friends, hundreds of friends, telling them when this comes to a vote, when it will come to a vote, you have to vote no. So this is going to be a huge fight in the Congress when Obama hopefully will have to persuade a reluctant Congress to ease sanctions. This is going to be an interesting drama to see played out. So finally, I wanted to talk about our U.S. policy in the Middle East and how it relates to the primary religious force in the region, which is Islam. We are going to have to decide at some point, choose between our old allies, the strongmen of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, even Israel, and a different possible set of alliances or relationships, one of which might be Iran in some time in the future, and other countries that are going to be based on more democratic forms of government and be inspired by the values of the Arab Spring, which we saw a few years ago. And I think we have to turn away from our previous alliances with Saudi Arabia and these countries, with Assad and Mubarak and all these people, and we have to find other options, go in a different direction. And we will have to decide whether we want to remain implacable enemies of Islamism, and now there's Islamism that's extreme and terrorist, but there's also Islamism that's political and nonviolent. We will have to decide whether we want to accommodate a Middle East that increasingly expresses its politics through religious identity. Infusing Islam into a nation's politics is no more dangerous than infusing religious ideas into American or Israeli society. The key question is, what form does the religious expression take? If it's intolerant, extremist, and violent, then it has to be rejected, like Al-Qaeda or the settler movement in Israel. But if Islamism is tolerant and populist and nonviolent, as the Muslim Brotherhood was in Egypt when it was in power, before it was overthrown, that is entirely legitimate. And that's a lesson we have not learned in this country. We have religion in our country, and it infuses a lot of the things that we do, and some of us who are members of religious minorities are very sensitive to that issue, but we have religion in this country. But it does not cause us to be at war with each other. It doesn't provoke terrorism and stuff like that. And there is a way that that could happen in the Middle East as well, I would maintain. The U.S. has not embraced such a view of Islam in the region, and instead we've seen Islam, no matter how it's practiced, as the enemy. Our targeted drone killings, which Jim mentioned, have murdered more than 3,000 Muslims, many civilians, and have made enemies of virtually all of Islam. This is unsustainable if we're to have a constructive relationship with the Muslim Arab world. And we must do that for our sake and the sake of the world's Muslims. Thanks.